Working women, a brief look from the 1880s to the 1920s and after. The thing that's really striking about this time period is it's a period of diversifying jobs for white women. White women can find work as factory workers. They can find secretarial work, which used to be a male job, is now becoming a female job. Of course, when it was a male job, it was an opportunity to learn to become a businessman. When it's a female job, it's just being a secretary. Retail sales, common female professions like teaching and nursing, new female professions like social work, home economics. And there's a few women who go into what are considered masculine professions like law, medicine, and science. The thing is, though, for white women, working was something you did before marriage, and you were supposed to stop after marriage. There were some exceptions, but a white woman who continued working after marriage, she did it because she was a dedicated professional, so one of those few doctors or lawyers or scientists, and even most of them stopped, or financial necessity. So in 1920, only 9% of married women were working. The thing behind that is, though, that gives a false picture of white men as being able to support their families. In reality, a lot of those women did things that brought in some extra money for the household. So they might take in boarders, they might take in laundry, they might do home sewing at home, they might sell eggs, a variety of ways to bring in just a little bit of extra money to help support the household. Really different picture, as we know, for black women. Black women were expected to be workers, and that working was expected to continue while they were married. So in large southern cities, 50 to 70% of black women were employed. Married black women were 5 times as likely to be employed as married white women. Black women generally had to work through their childbearing years, so while they were bearing children, they were also working. If they were going to retire, they retire when they became grandmothers, though at that point they were expected to take on some of the child care for their daughters and sons to help them. Even so, 1/4 of black women over 65 years of age in urban areas of the South were still employed. What most black women did was they did sharecropping. 9 out of 10 black people lived in the South, and 80% of those people lived in rural areas. In 1910, 90% of Southern African Americans in agriculture were tenants, sharecroppers, contract labor. But for the 90%, they are basically having 2 types of obligations. They work in the field and they work at home. Black men would periodically have to leave to go somewhere to get extra wages at some kind of work. And at that case, as a woman, you might be left to manage your family's sharecropping farm. Women had to do, as one person said, a man's share in the field and a woman's part at home. A woman would rise at 4 a.m. with the roosters to prepare breakfast, molasses, salt pork, and cornbread. She would have to fetch water and wood, prepare meals, milk the cow if they were lucky enough to have one, grind corn for meal, tend the garden, gather eggs, make soap, do laundry, bathe the children, and also have to hoe and pick, even chop woods and plow sometimes. If she outlived her husband, landowners didn't want sharecroppers who were female-headed households on their land, and so they would probably be ejected and forced to move to the city with their children. Wives, in addition to all of that, tried to bring in extra money by picking and selling berries, selling eggs, butter, vegetables for a little money, or doing midwifery or laundry to bring in a little extra cash. That money might be saved towards buying land, or alternatively, it might go to buy shoes so that your children could attend school. So we always talk about the Great Migration to the north, but part of that is actually Black people moving from the rural areas in the South to the urban areas in the South. So by 1910, about 18% of the Southern Black population lived in towns of 2,500 inhabitants or more. So Black people made up about 30% of Southern urban areas. And a number of these people are women. Some women moved to the cities and towns with their husbands, but there were also single women who came for opportunities. And remember those married women who lose their husbands and then are forced off the land? A lot of times they had to move with their children to the cities to find work. 50 to 70% of the Black women in these cities and towns were employed for at least part of the year. Sometimes they worked as farm laborers on nearby farms for extra money and to escape servant work. But a lot of them, of course, had to do domestic servant work. Domestic work was what most Black women did. 7 out of 10 Black female wage earners worked as servants or laundresses. With very few alternative types of work, that meant that Black domestic workers faced the worst conditions, the lowest wages, and the longest hours. And they were, in fact, so cheap that all but the poorest white families saw Black servants as a necessity. So in the South, white factory workers might be able to afford a maid. Older women were most likely to be laundresses because it was the easiest way to manage childcare. As you can see here with these women, they're working at their laundry, but they also have their children with them so they can keep an eye on them. There was, however, a small, visible, vocal, urban Black middle class. And in these families, the patriarchs managed as craftsmen and entrepreneurs and often had a great deal of community respect, but their wives and daughters usually had to earn wages. Sewing and teaching were seen as genteel activities. Seamstress did a variety of sewing. It was a good job for women with young children. Once again, it was something you could do while keeping an eye on your children around you. The problem was the demand varied. You would work for Black clients, but Black clients had a hard time paying you because they didn't have a lot of money and could only pay a little amount. Or you would work for white clients who had more money to pay, but they couldn't be depended on to actually pay the people doing the work for them. And it would be very hard to get that money from them if they refused to pay you. So probably if you were a seamstress, there's a good chance you had to do additional work as well. Teaching. After the Freedmen's Aid volunteers left, and this is just during Reconstruction, they were replaced by basically the worst white teachers were then employed in the public schools to serve Black children. But the Black community pretty much rose up against this and pressured white school boards to hire Black teachers to teach their children. The school boards, probably simply because they could pay the Black teachers less, gave in to this demand. And this is why Black colleges very quickly developed teaching programs to supply the need for Black teachers. Teaching was the largest field of white-collar employment for Black women, who made up the majority of the teaching staff in Black schools. They outnumbered Black male teachers 3-1 in the South. The thing was, it was professional work, so it had higher status, but they were paid less than white teachers. They were paid less than white male teachers, white female teachers, and black male teachers. And so usually during the summer, they had to work as a laundress or seamstress or some other way to earn some money. Compared to a white Southern counterpart, the black instructor taught more children, 95 rather than 45. In a smaller school, she had less equipment, books, pencils, slates, and less classroom time, 3 to 4 months in a term rather than 5 to 6 months in a school year. In essence, probably for a lot of the black women teaching, it was as much as anything a form of community service. It certainly wasn't something went into to earn a great deal of money. And notably, a number of them worked hard to bring in classroom materials that provided a positive view of black people, even though that was not approved of by white school boards. The other professional option was nursing. Nursing became professionalized and respectable in the decades after the Civil War. It previously had been something that was associated with poor, drunk women. But to be a professional nurse required training in a nursing program and practicing in a hospital. The problem was, of course, northern hospitals' nursing schools imposed racial quotas. They might take in black pupils, but only so many. Southern schools excluded black women entirely. In the 1890s to 1920s, there was a wave of foundation of black hospitals and training schools for nurses and doctors, some as black community-sponsored projects, some as partly white philanthropy. In some cases, urban areas, when they built a new hospital, they would give the old hospital to the black community. This meant that black hospitals and nursing programs tended to struggle with inadequate finances, dilapidated physical plants, and generally exploited student nurses to get as much work out of them as possible. Black nursing schools, of course, emphasized duty to the black community. It becomes even more complicated as states start passing licensing and registration laws, which made it even harder for black nurses. In southern states, sometimes they banned black women from taking the licensing exams or gave them alternative exams, so you had a black license, not a white license. Professional organizations, of course, denied entrance or membership to black nurses, so black nurses had to form their own organizations. Black nurses earned lower wages, even when working for the federal government, than white nurses. And white supervisors, of course, said this was just simply because black nurses were inferior. And this kind of racism was common among white nurses in both the North and the South. What about other professions? There were black women journalists. Ida B. Wells, of course, is the famous example. But there were other women as well who did that and were writers. There were also black women who became doctors and lawyers. But once again, a big problem with that is access to training. One problem that develops in the early 20th century is that of community activists. Because of the lack of support for the black community activists had built community service organizations like orphanages to serve the black community themselves. But as social work becomes a profession that you're supposed to have training and licensing for, black women who were older activists who didn't have that training or licensing were being driven out of the profession. In some cases, you actually have the result where, for example, like in Illinois, there was a black orphanage outside of Chicago, has to close down because the black director was not considered qualified to run it. But of course, who else was going to do it? So in conclusion, what we're seeing at this point in time is a lot of diversification of opportunities for white women. However, they did have strong gender constraints. They had a very tough time getting into certain professions that were considered to be male professions, all of the high-paying ones, and by definition, any profession that was dominated by women earned less than the men did. And also they were expected to give up working after marriage. On the other hand, for black women, they were expected to work, and they were expected to continue that work after marriage. On the other hand, though, there were extremely limited opportunities for black women to pursue. And one of the more depressing consequences is that you have young women who are going to school, becoming educated, getting high school degrees, even getting college degrees, and finding themselves completely unable to find work worthy of their qualifications, and having to fall back even into domestic work in some cases. And here's the primary sources I went to.